I keep a 1978 solid brass surveyor's transit compass on the left corner of my oak desk. It's heavy, cold to the touch, and the glass face is slightly scratched from decades of field work out in the high desert. Whenever I need to think, I reach out and turn the brass bezel, just a fraction of an inch. I like the mechanical click it makes. It reminds me that no matter how disoriented you feel, true north is still out there, waiting for you to find it. I was spinning that bezel on a Tuesday afternoon when the email arrived from the estate accountant. It was a very short, very clinical message, confirming that the transfer of $4,850,000 had been successfully routed to my son's private account. It was his mother's money. My late wife, Sarah, had set it up in a trust years before she passed, stipulating that Julian would receive the full sum upon his 30th birthday. I didn't mind the money going to him. I didn't need the money. What I minded was what happened exactly 48 hours later. Julian changed his phone number. He didn't call to tell me. He didn't drop by the house. He simply ceased to exist on my end of the cellular network. When I tried to dial him that Friday to ask if he wanted to get lunch, I got an automated voice telling me the subscriber was no longer in service. Think about that for a second. You raise a boy, you teach him how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie. You sit by his hospital bed when he gets his appendix out at 14, and the moment the inheritance clears, you become an automated error message. Before we get into exactly how a 30-year-old with new millions learns about hydrogeological zoning the hard way, if you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. My name is Elias. I am 68 years old, and for 35 of those years, I worked as a civil and water resources engineer here in Bend, Oregon. If you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, you know that out here, land is just scenery. Water is power. The people who control the water control the development, the agriculture, and the future. I spent my life mapping watersheds, drawing up utility infrastructures, and negotiating land use permits for the county. My brain is wired for logistics. When someone tells me a lie, I don't argue with them. I just reach for my favorite graphite pencil and start tracing property lines on the county maps I keep spread across my drafting table. I measure twice. I cut once. Julian was a smart kid, but he possessed a very specific kind of modern arrogance. He believed that money could bypass time. He went to a good business school, wore expensive unlined blazers, and spoke entirely in the language of disruption, synergy, and scaling. Whenever I tried to talk to him about the foundational things, like how a concrete foundation is actually poured or how municipal infrastructure works, his jaw would do that thing, that slow, grinding thing. He would nod politely, his eyes glazing over, already looking past me to his phone. Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment but isn't. When he said my advice was fine, what he really meant was that I was obsolete, a relic of the analog age. Sarah's passing had been sudden, a quiet, fast illness that hollowed out our house in less than 6 months. In the aftermath, Julian and I had drifted, but I thought it was just grief. I thought we were both just navigating the empty space she left behind. I didn't know it yet, but the drift wasn't grief. It was calculation. He was waiting out the clock until his 30th birthday. When the automated message played on my phone, that Tuesday, something in my stomach shifted. I tried his email, blocked. I drove past his downtown apartment later that evening. The lights were off, and a moving van had already cleared out his spot in the parking garage. He hadn't just moved on. He had deliberately erased me. I didn't shout. I didn't punch a wall or call the police to report a missing person. I sat in my car for a while. Beautiful the way certain storms are beautiful, that cold realization washing over me. He thought silence was absence. He didn't understand that silence is just a space waiting to be filled. I drove back to my house, walked into my study, and sat down at my desk. The silence of the empty house sat like a fifth guest at a dinner table of one. I picked up my graphite pencil, and I went very, very quiet. I didn't reach out again. For 6 months, I lived my life. I consulted on a few municipal projects, tended to my garden, and kept the brass compass polished. I let him think he had won. I let him believe that he had successfully, surgically removed his father from his new wealthy existence. Then, one rainy Thursday morning in November, Marcus walked into my study without knocking. Marcus has been my closest friend and my attorney for nearly 4 decades. He specializes in property and water rights law. He is the kind of man who reads terms and conditions for fun. 30 years ago, we went ice fishing up at Paulina Lake. Marcus accidentally dropped the truck keys down the ice hole. We had to hike 5 miles through a blinding snowstorm to reach the highway. He didn't complain once, just methodically calculated our pace and body temperatures. He is practical, relentlessly honest, and the sharpest legal mind in Deschutes County. Marcus shook out his wet umbrella, dropping a thick manila folder onto my maps. He didn't say hello. He just tapped the folder with a thick, calloused index finger. "Your boy is making moves," Marcus said, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of a man who has seen too many fools part with their money. I didn't look up immediately. I kept shading the topographical lines of a ridge I was reviewing for the county. "Julian is a grown man, Marcus. His moves are his own. Not this move," Marcus said, pulling up a chair. It scraped against the hardwood, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He just filed the incorporation papers for a luxury eco-resort. He's calling it the Elysium Retreat. High-end off-grid cabins, an artisanal farm-to-table restaurant, a holistic spa. He's pitching it to private investors to match the $4 million he just dropped to acquire the land. I stopped shading. The graphite pencil hovered a millimeter above the paper. $4 million? Where did he buy? Marcus leaned forward. The old Miller tract, the entire 300-acre parcel nestled in the lower basin of Whisper Creek. I set the pencil down, very slowly. The Miller tract. It was a stunning piece of land, a breathtaking expanse of pine forests and gentle slopes. On a brochure, it looked like paradise. It looked like the perfect place for a wealthy visionary to build a monument to his own genius. He closed the deal yesterday, Marcus continued, watching my face closely. Bought it outright from the bank. Paid cash. He's already hired an architectural firm out of Portland and is breaking ground on the access roads next week. He's moving fast, Elias. Too fast. He didn't use local counsel. He doesn't trust local, I said quietly. He thinks anyone over the age of 50 with dirt on their boots is a liability. Well, Marcus said, leaning back and crossing his arms. His Portland lawyers did a standard title search. Clear title, no liens. They checked the county zoning. It's zoned for commercial recreation. They checked the soil reports. Everything looks perfect, assembled from a catalog. But they didn't dig deep enough into the archives, I murmured, my eyes drifting to the brass compass. No, they didn't, Marcus agreed, a grim, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. They didn't check the historical exemptions. They didn't check the 1992 Hydrogeological Reallocation Registry. Nobody said anything for a while. The silence had weight to it now. It wasn't the empty silence of a lonely house anymore. It was the heavy, charged silence before a storm breaks. He thinks he owns the valley, I said. He owns the dirt, Marcus corrected. But to run a resort of that size, he needs commercial water rights. He needs environmental clearance to tap the aquifer. He needs the Whisper Creek extraction permits. Our eyes met. We both knew exactly who held those permits 30 years ago, when the county was restructuring the watershed. The Miller Tract was deemed too ecologically sensitive for standard municipal water lines. The rights weren't held by the city. They were grandfathered in, severed from the land itself, and placed in a private environmental stewardship trust to prevent mass corporate development. A trust that I had helped design, and more importantly, a trust that I personally administered as the sole surviving trustee. He has no idea, Marcus said softly. He's about to sink his entire inheritance into building a multi-million-dollar ghost town. He can build the cabins, he can build the spa, but without your signature, he can't flush a single toilet or turn on a single faucet. I looked down at the map on my desk. I picked up the graphite pencil again. I didn't feel a rush of vindictive joy. I just felt a cold, precise clarity. Julian had cut me out of his life because he thought I had nothing left to offer him. He was about to find out that cleverness is fast, but what I do is slow. Let him build, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let him spend it all. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding completely. I'll keep monitoring the county filings. Thank you, Marcus. He stood up, grabbing his umbrella. Elias? Yes, he should have kept your number. With that, Marcus left, the front door clicking shut behind him. I sat alone in my study, the rain beating against the window pane. I reached out and turned the brass bezel of my compass. One click. Sarah used to say that Julian had his eyes fixed so far on the horizon, he never noticed the ground he was standing on. She said it with affection. Mothers have a way of spinning a flaw into a poetic trait. I saw it differently. I saw a boy who refused to look at the dirt because he thought he was too good for it. When he was 16, I tried to teach him how to change the brake pads on his Honda Civic, a 2004 model, reliable, utilitarian. He paid a kid at school $50 to do it for him behind the bleachers. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He just adjusted his collar and said he was delegating. He was 16. That was the dynamic. Sarah was the mortar that kept the bricks together. And when she was gone, there was nothing left to absorb the friction, bare metal on bare metal. After Julian vanished and the phone went dead, a part of me expected the anger to arrive. I waited for it. I expected to wake up one morning furious, wanting to track him down and demand an explanation. But the anger never came. I went very, very quiet instead. Anger is a volatile fuel. It burns hot and runs out quickly. Patience, though. Patience is a glacier. It moves slow, and it flattens everything in its path. Winter came to the high desert, blanketing the pines in heavy wet snow. I spent December and January inside, keeping the fire going, reviewing civil engineering contracts for the neighboring county, and watching my son's ambition unfold in the local business journals. He was everywhere. The Elysium retreat was the talk of the region. He hired a public relations firm out of Seattle, and suddenly his face was on the cover of a regional lifestyle magazine. I bought a copy at the grocery store, standing in aisle 4, holding the glossy paper under the fluorescent lights. The headline read, "The Self-Made Visionary Redefining High Desert Luxury." Self-made. I almost smiled. Almost. Which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle on a Tuesday morning. He had taken his mother's money, completely erased the people who had actually built his foundation, and rebranded himself as an independent pioneer. The article detailed his masterstroke of acquiring the pristine Miller Tract. It included quotes from his Portland architects, talking about seamless integration with nature, holistic wellness, and unrestricted access to the untouched beauty of the valley. There was a render of the resort spanning 2 pages. It was breathtaking, I'll admit. 20 luxury A-frame cabins with floor-to-ceiling glass scattered along the ridge, a central lodge with a sprawling outdoor dining terrace, and the crown jewel, a 40,000-gallon heated infinity pool overlooking the valley, flanked by 4 individual hydrotherapy spas. I stared at the picture of the infinity pool. I stared at the spas. Then I looked at the quoted capacity of the resort. 60 guests, plus 30 staff members, commercial kitchens, commercial laundry. Here is the thing about water in the high desert that Portland architects don't seem to grasp. Water is heavy. It requires immense, consistent pressure to move. To supply a commercial kitchen, a commercial laundry facility, 20 luxury bathrooms, and a 40,000-gallon pool, you aren't just tapping a residential well. You are drawing massive volume from the deep aquifer. You need industrial-grade pumping stations, commercial filtration infrastructure, and most importantly, you need the legal authorization to extract that volume from a protected ecological zone. They were designing a cruise ship and building it in a dry dock, entirely unaware that the ocean belonged to me. By March, the snow thawed, and the heavy machinery rolled in. I didn't drive out to the site. I didn't need to. I could track the progress entirely through the county permit office, public records. Marcus would drop by my house every other Friday with a fresh stack of printouts, shaking his head in disbelief. We were sitting in my kitchen one morning, drinking black coffee. The kitchen still smelled like the cinnamon toast Sarah used to make, an olfactory ghost I hadn't the heart to scrub away. They poured the foundations for the main lodge on Tuesday, Marcus said, flipping through a file. They're trenching the access roads now, laying the custom copper piping. He's sparing absolutely no expense. He flew in timber from British Columbia. He's paying union crews double overtime to stay ahead of schedule. He wants to open by Labor Day, I noted, taking a sip of my coffee. He wants the autumn tourist rush. He's burning through the trust fund, Marcus said, tapping a pen against the table. He secured a secondary construction loan for another $2 million, using the land and the half-built resort as collateral. He's leveraged to the absolute hilt, Elias. If this thing doesn't open on time and start generating revenue immediately, the bank will swallow him whole. He always liked high stakes, I said softly. It's not high stakes if you're playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded cylinder, Marcus retorted. I checked the municipal filings again this morning. His lawyers applied for a standard residential well permit. The county clerk stamped it, assuming it was for a single-family dwelling because of how the initial holding company was structured. They haven't applied for the commercial environmental variance yet. They're saving the utility connections for Phase 3 of construction. I set my mug down. They're waiting until the structures are finished to tie into the water system. Exactly, Marcus said. They think it's a formality, a rubber stamp at the end of the project. They think they just hook up the pipes, turn the valve, and the county smiles and waves. I looked out the kitchen window. The daffodils were just starting to push through the cold soil. When do the county inspectors go out for the Phase 3 utility sign-off? August, Marcus said, right before the final certificate of occupancy is issued, right when he's completely out of money and desperate to open the doors. Perfect. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Elias, I've known you a long time. I know you're hurt. But if you let him build this entire thing, if you let him exhaust his mother's money and take on millions in debt before pulling the rug out, it will ruin him. Financially, professionally. He will be wiped out. I'm not pulling the rug out from under anyone, Marcus, I said, my voice steady, entirely devoid of malice. I am simply sitting in my house. I didn't ask him to buy that land. I didn't ask him to build a resort. I didn't ask him to ignore basic civil engineering due diligence. He cut me off. He made it very clear that my expertise was no longer required. I am just respecting his boundaries. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for a crack for a sign of hesitation. He found nothing. I meant what I said. I mean that literally. I wasn't setting a trap. I was just the cliff edge he was gleefully sprinting toward. I'll keep watching the folder. I'll keep watching the filings. But you need to prepare yourself. When the county denies that commercial water permit, when they tell him the rights are held by a private trust, he's going to find out your name is on the deed. And he is going to come here. I know, I said. Spring turned into a blistering summer. The construction at Whisper Creek accelerated into a frantic, feverish blur. From what I heard in town, Julian was a tyrant on site. He was firing foremen, screaming at contractors, pushing everyone to the absolute brink to meet his September 1st grand opening. He had already started taking non-refundable deposits for reservations. He was selling the dream of the Elysium retreat to wealthy tech executives in Silicon Valley, promising them an oasis of luxury and water in the arid desert. I heard it all, secondhand, sitting at the counter of a local diner. The waitress, Clara, who had been pouring my coffee since 1998, topped off my mug while two general contractors a few stools down complained about the rich kid from Portland screaming about copper pipe fittings. I didn't say a word. I just drank my coffee and calculated the exact hydraulic pressure required to push water up the grade he was building on. By late July, the buildings were finished. The glass was installed. The 40,000-gallon pool was beautifully, flawlessly tiled. It sat entirely empty, baking in the high desert sun. The trap was fully constructed. He had built it himself, board by board, dollar by dollar. All that was left was for him to try and turn on the tap. I sat at my desk on a Tuesday evening, spinning the brass bezel of my compass, waiting for the county inspector to make his final visit. The silence in my house felt different now. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a held breath. August in Bend is unforgiving. The heat bakes the moisture out of the air until the sky looks pale and bruised. On the 12th of the month, the temperature hit 102 degrees. I was out in the garage with the door rolled up, rehandling an old framing hammer. It was a plum fiberglass model I'd bought back in 1985, but I was replacing the cracked grip with a custom piece of hickory I'd soaked in linseed oil for 3 days. There is a specific rhythm to sanding wood that I find comforting. It requires your hands to pay attention even when your mind is somewhere else. My mind was out on the Miller Tract. My landline rang at exactly 2:11 p.m. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and picked up the receiver mounted on the drywall. He turned the valve, Marcus said. No, hello, no preamble. I leaned against the workbench. And nothing came out but air and a lot of expensive dust, Marcus replied, the grim satisfaction evident even through the static of the line. Dave Keller was the inspector they sent out. I knew Dave. I trained Dave back in '96 when he was a green intern, terrified of reading a water meter wrong. He is a meticulous man who does not care how much your shoes cost. Walk me through it, I said. Marcus had gotten the full report from Dave over a beer an hour earlier. Julian had orchestrated a whole event for the final sign-off. He had his Portland lawyers there, his lead architect, and a photographer to capture the momentous occasion of the resort officially coming online. Julian was standing by the main pump station in a crisp linen shirt, looking every bit the visionary. Dave walked the site. He noted the flawless copper piping, the commercial-grade boilers, the massive empty infinity pool. Then he asked the lead lawyer for the commercial hydro extraction variants. The lawyer confidently handed Dave a standard residential well permit. Dave looked at the paper, looked at the 40,000-gallon pool, and asked if they were planning to fill it with Perrier. The lawyer got defensive. Julian stepped in, using that slow, grinding jaw motion of his, and tried to explain that the residential permit was a placeholder, that the county would expedite the commercial variants because of the tax revenue the resort would bring in. He tried to speak the language of synergy to a man who only speaks in gallons per minute. Dave calmly pulled out his county tablet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pulled up the 1992 Whisper Creek Environmental Stewardship Trust and read the deed restrictions out loud. He explained that the valley's commercial water rights were severed from the land 30 years ago to prevent this exact type of ecological strain. He explained that no amount of tax revenue could override a private trust. Julian had demanded to know who controlled the trust. He was ready to write a check, ready to buy out whoever this stubborn local was. Dave tapped the screen, turned the tablet around, and showed my son the name of the sole surviving trustee. Dave said the color drained out of your boy's face so fast he thought he was going to pass out. Marcus told me. The lawyer started stammering. Julian just stared at the screen. He didn't say a word. He just turned around, walked to his car, and drove off, left the architect and the lawyers standing in the dust. I looked at the hickory hammer handle on my workbench. The oil was sinking into the grain, bringing out the dark, resilient lines of the wood. He won't come to me yet, I said. He'll try to fight it. Of course he will, Marcus agreed. He's going to spend the next 2 weeks trying to punch his way through a brick wall. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you, for real. The next 14 days were a masterclass in watching a drowning man refuse a life preserver because he doesn't like the color. Julian's pride was a terminal condition. Instead of driving to my house, he drove to Seattle. He hired a massive corporate litigation firm, the kind that occupies the top 3 floors of a glass skyscraper and bills $800 an hour. They tried everything. They filed an emergency injunction against the county. They tried to subpoena the trust documents, claiming the 1892 charter was obsolete under modern zoning amendments. They tried to argue that the trust had been abandoned. They didn't realize who had drafted that trust. Marcus had built it like a submarine. There were no leaks, no loopholes, and no expiration date. Every time the Seattle lawyers filed a motion, Marcus countered it with a single, devastatingly simple piece of paper from our archives. We didn't even have to go to court. Marcus just sent certified letters to the judge outlining the established legal precedent. The judge dismissed Julian's injunctions with extreme prejudice. By the third week of August, the reality of the math began to set in. Julian had taken over $500,000 in non-refundable deposits for the grand opening on September 1st. Wealthy clients had booked flights, arranged private transport, and blocked out their schedules. Worse than the deposits was the bank. The regional bank that had issued the $2 million secondary construction loan had automated alerts tied to county permit databases. When the commercial water variance was officially marked as denied trust conflict in the system, it triggered a default clause in Julian's loan covenant. You cannot use a functioning commercial property as collateral if it cannot legally function. The bank froze his remaining line of credit. His construction crews, who were supposed to be doing the final landscaping and interior detailing, walked off the job when their Friday checks bounced. The Elysium retreat was completely silent. The beautiful glass cabins baked in the sun. The artisanal restaurant kitchens sat wrapped in factory plastic. The custom hydrotherapy spas were just expensive dry basins. Marcus came over on a Tuesday evening with a cardboard banker's box full of documents. We cleared off the dining room table. The waiter appeared. Dessert. All four of us stared at him. He backed away slowly. That was a memory from years ago. A dinner in Portland when Julian first pitched a ridiculous tech startup idea, and Sarah, Marcus, and I had all just stared at him in stunned silence. The memory flickered in my mind and vanished as Marcus began laying out the papers. We organized the original charter, the deed restrictions, the environmental baseline reports, and the ledger of the trust. We built a paper wall that no amount of Seattle lawyer money could breach. The paper trail was absolute. His lawyers dropped him this morning, Marcus said, placing a manila folder squarely in the center of the table. They realized he's out of liquid capital. They billed him $80,000 for 2 weeks of failing to break our trust, and when he couldn't pay the latest retainer, they formally withdrew as counsel. I ran my hand over the smooth edge of the table. What about the bank? They issued a formal notice of intent to foreclose, Marcus replied, tapping the folder. They gave him until September 5th to cure the default, which means he has to secure the water rights by then, or they seize the entire property, liquidate the assets, and come after his personal accounts for the deficiency. He was out of time. He was out of money. He was out of arrogance. I knew with the cold certainty of a man who has watched weather patterns for 30 years that the storm was finally going to break over my house. On the 28th of August, 3 days before his impossible grand opening, I was sitting on my front porch. It was 4:15 p.m. The heat of the day was just beginning to break, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel driveway. I had a glass of iced tea in my hand. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. I heard the engine before I saw the car, a black Range Rover, covered in a fine layer of white construction dust, turned off the county road and rolled slowly up my driveway. It didn't park smoothly. It jerked to a stop, the tires biting aggressively into the gravel, parked crookedly across 2 spaces. The engine cut off. For a long minute, nothing happened. The tinted windows hid the driver. The silence sat heavy and suffocating in the late afternoon air. I took a sip of my tea. It was perfectly cold. Finally, the heavy driver's side door clicked open. Julian stepped out of the Range Rover. He didn't look like a visionary anymore. The crisp linen shirt from the magazine cover was wrinkled and damp with sweat at the collar. He had lost weight. The sharp, confident angles of his face had sunk into hollow, exhausted lines. He slammed the car door, and the sound echoed across the empty yard. He walked up the gravel path, his expensive Italian leather loafers scuffing against the stones. He stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He looked up. Our eyes met. His jaw was doing that thing. That slow grinding thing. But it wasn't arrogant this time. It was frantic. "Dad," he said. "Julian, can I come in?" I stood up, taking my iced tea with me. I didn't say anything. I just turned and opened the screen door, letting it swing shut behind me. I heard him exhale, a jagged, shallow breath, before he followed me inside. We walked into my study. The air conditioning was humming quietly. The room smelled of old paper, cedar, and the faint metallic tang of the brass compass on my desk. I sat down in my leather chair. I didn't offer him a seat. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking at the topographical maps spread across my drafting table. "I don't have a lot of time." Julian started, immediately slipping back into the cadence of a man who thought he was in a boardroom. "The bank is threatening foreclosure on the 5th. I need the water variance signed. I know you're angry. I get it. I handled the transition poorly. But this is business, and I'm prepared to make you whole." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tossing it onto my desk. It landed next to my graphite pencil. "That's a drafted agreement from a local mediator," Julian said, his voice tightening. "I will pay the trust $250,000 for a perpetual easement and the commercial extraction rights. Cash. Financed through a private backer I lined up this morning. We sign it, Dave Keller stamps the permit tomorrow, and we can all move on." I looked at the folded paper. I didn't touch it. $250,000, I said softly. "It's a more than fair market rate." He pressed, taking a step closer to the desk. "You're holding up a $10 million valuation over a bureaucratic technicality from 30 years ago. I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm trying to fix this." I reached out and spun the brass bezel of my compass. One click. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "Here's the thing about technicalities, Julian," I said, leaning back. "They are only technicalities to people who don't understand the foundation. To an engineer, there is no such thing as a technicality. There is only load-bearing structure and things that collapse. You built a $10 million structure on sand. I built it on land I own," he snapped, his voice finally breaking its corporate veneer. His hands were trembling. He gripped the edge of my desk. "I own the Miller Tract. It's mine. I paid $4 million for it." I held up one hand. "Just one." He stopped talking instantly, his mouth snapping shut. "You own the dirt." I corrected him, my voice completely level. "I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. You own the rocks and the pine needles. But you do not own the ecosystem. And trust me, you cannot buy it for $250,000. I picked up the graphite pencil and rolled it between my fingers. "You know what I did when I found out you blocked my number. I went very, very quiet. I sat right here and I let you operate. You wanted to be a self-made man. You wanted to prove that you didn't need anyone, especially not me. So I gave you exactly what you asked for, my complete and total absence." Julian swallowed hard. The silence in the room had weight to it again, pressing down on his shoulders. I have 60 guests flying in next weekend," he stammered, the desperation finally leaking out. "I owe $85,412 to the landscapers alone. If the bank forecloses, they seize everything. The land, the buildings, my personal accounts. I will have nothing. Mom's money. It'll be gone. Completely gone." He tried to use her as a shield. Something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. A cold, heavy contraction, but I let it pass. "Leverage isn't about how hard you pull," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "It's about where you stand. You signed contracts you didn't read, based on assumptions you didn't verify. So what do you want?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You want me to beg? Fine. I'm begging. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I cut you off. I'm sorry I didn't call. Just tell me your price. Everyone has a price." I almost smiled. Almost. Not this trust. I opened the center drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, legal-sized document bound in a blue cover. I set it carefully on top of his folded settlement offer. "This is the original 1992 charter for the Whisper Creek Environmental Stewardship Trust," I said, tapping the blue cover. Marcus and I drafted it very carefully. We knew that eventually someone with a lot of money and 0 cents would try to build a monument to their own ego out there. We couldn't stop them from buying the land, but we could control the water. Julian stared at the document like it was a live explosive. Article 4, Section B, I recited from memory. The trust strictly prohibits the commercial extraction of water from the Whisper Creek aquifer by any private for-profit entity, unless I paused. Julian's eyes darted from the document to my face. Unless, I continued, the trust itself holds a controlling equity stake in the commercial venture, ensuring absolute oversight of ecological impact and operational compliance. The words hung in the air. Julian blinked, his brain struggling to process the legal phrasing through his panic. Then, I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. His hand, still gripping the edge of my desk, went entirely white at the knuckles. Controlling equity stake, Julian whispered. 51%, I clarified. The trust cannot legally issue a water variance to the Elysium Retreat LLC. It is prohibited by the charter. The only way the permit can be granted is if the Elysium Retreat LLC transfers 51% of its ownership shares, voting rights, and operational control to the trust. He stumbled back a step. His legs hit the leather guest chair, and he practically collapsed into it. "You want my company," he breathed, sounding horrified. "You want to steal my company." "I don't want your company," I said frankly. "I have no desire to run a hotel. But the law is the law. You can't buy something that isn't for sale, but you can definitely owe for it. If you want the water, you surrender majority control. The trust becomes the parent company. Marcus and I, as the administrators of the trust, become the majority board members. You will be a minority shareholder. You will answer to the board. Your budgets will be approved by the board. You will become, essentially, an employee of your own resort." "I can't," he gasped, burying his face in his hands. "I built it. It's mine. I'm the CEO. You are a 30-year-old boy who wrote bad checks on a good aquifer," I said, sliding the blue document across the desk toward him. "The transfer papers are attached to the back. Marcus drafted them this morning. You have until Friday before the bank takes 100% of it. I am offering you 49% and a salvaged reputation." He didn't move. He sat there, utterly broken, the hollow shell of a visionary, shattered by the weight of a single, invisible drop of water. I didn't gloat. I just waited. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off the seconds. Finally, Julian lowered his hands. His eyes were red, staring blankly at the brass compass. "If I sign it," he whispered, "what happens to me?" "You go to work," I said, "and you learn how the plumbing actually functions." He stared at the paperwork for a long time. The silence just had a specific kind of gravity. It was the sound of leverage doing its quiet, heavy work. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. He unspooled the cap of his pen. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy, black resin, silver trim. It probably cost him $500, a gift to himself when he bought the land, a symbol of the empire he was supposed to build. He hovered the silver nib over the signature line of the transfer agreement. For a second, I thought he might snap the pen in half. His hand shook with a fine, high-frequency tremor. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. A car drove by on the county road outside. A faint hum that faded into nothing. But he didn't snap the pen. He pressed down and signed his name. He signed it 3 times. One signature for the immediate trust transfer, one for the new operational hierarchy agreement, and one for the county permit authorization. He didn't say a word through the entire process. He just pushed the blue-bound document back across my oak desk. He didn't look at me. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a handshake or a speech about hard lessons. I simply took the papers, aligned the edges perfectly, and placed them in my top drawer. "Dave Keller will be out at the site at 8 a.m. tomorrow," I said quietly. "Have your maintenance crew ready at the main valve." Julian stood up. He looked around my study, his eyes lingering on the topographical maps, the graphite pencils, the brass compass. He looked at the room as if seeing it for the first time. or perhaps realizing it was the room where his multi-million-dollar empire had just quietly become a subsidiary. He turned and walked out. The front screen door closed with a soft, defeated click. I stayed in my chair and listened to his Range Rover start up, crunch slowly down the gravel driveway, and turn back onto the county road. Marcus came over the next morning at 6. We drank black coffee in the kitchen and finalized the trust integrations. By 9 o'clock, Dave Keller had officially stamped the commercial hydro-extraction variants. The Elysium Retreat was no longer a beautiful, useless sculpture, baking in the high desert sun. It was a fully functional facility, legally operated under the strict, uncompromising oversight of the Whisper Creek Environmental Stewardship Trust. I didn't go to the grand opening on September 1st. I heard from Clara down at the diner that it was a spectacular event. The public relations firm from Seattle got all their glossy photographs. The Silicon Valley executives flew in, drank their artisanal cocktails on the terrace, and soaked in the 40,000-gallon heated infinity pool. They were completely unaware that the water reflecting the desert sky belonged to a 68-year-old retired engineer sitting in his garage, sanding a hickory hammer handle. The bank was satisfied. The construction crews finally got paid. Julian saved his mother's money from being liquidated in a catastrophic foreclosure, but the cost of that salvation was absolute. The first quarterly board meeting happened in November. We didn't hold it in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in Portland. We held it right at my dining room table. Marcus sat on my right, a yellow legal pad resting in front of him. Julian sat across from us. He brought a stack of financial reports, his laptop, and a very different demeanor. He wasn't wearing his signature-unlined blazer. He wore a plain, dark gray sweater. His jaw wasn't doing that grinding thing anymore. "The winter bookings are at 82% capacity," Julian said, sliding a printed spreadsheet across the table toward me. "Revenue is exceeding the initial projections by 4.5%. However, we have a mechanical issue with the primary filtration pumps for the spa tier. They're cycling too frequently due to mineral buildup from the aquifer." He looked at me. He didn't look at me as a relic of the analog age. He looked at me as the majority shareholder, and more importantly, as the only hydro engineer in the room. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the flow rate numbers. "Have your maintenance crew pull the intake screens," I told him. "The Miller tract water has a high calcium carbonate concentration. You need to backwash the system with a mild acidic solution every 72 hours, not weekly as your manual suggests. I'll write down the proper mixture ratio. If you ignore it, you'll burn out the impellers by January, and replacing them will cost you $14,000 and 3 days of downtime." "Understood," Julian said quietly. He typed a note into his laptop. That was the new dynamic. Civil, professional, brutally grounded in reality. Later in the meeting, he pitched an expansion plan for 5 additional A-frame cabins along the eastern ridge. Marcus and I vetoed it immediately, citing the ecological load limit, strictly defined in the 1992 charter. Julian didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or talk about synergy. He just nodded, closed that specific file, and moved on to the marketing budget. It wasn't a warm, fuzzy reconciliation. There were no tearful apologies or sudden cinematic hugs. Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment but isn't. We weren't fine, but we were functional. Like a repaired cast iron pipe, there was a visible heavy weld where the break used to be, but it held the pressure. When December brought the heavy snows back to the region, the resort faced its first real operational stress test. A massive blizzard swept through the basin, knocking out the main grid power for the entire valley. Julian had installed backup generators, of course, massive state-of-the-art diesel units, but he hadn't accounted for the freezing point of the specific commercial-grade fuel his Portland procurement team had ordered. The fuel lines gelled. The generators failed to engage. The luxury cabins lost heat rapidly, and the custom copper pipes were hours away from freezing and bursting. He called me at 2:14 a.m. I picked up the landline in the dark. "The generators are down," he said. His voice was tight, bordering on genuine panic. "The guests are freezing in the cabins. The local plumbers won't drive out in this storm. I don't know what to do. I didn't lecture him about fuel viscosity. I didn't remind him that he was the visionary CEO. I just got out of bed, put on my insulated Carhartt coveralls, the ones I've had since 1998, faded and patched at the knees, and threw my heavy canvas tool bag into the back of my truck. I put the truck in four-wheel drive and crawled the 15 miles out to the Miller Tract. The snow was coming down horizontal, pure whiteout conditions. When I pulled up to the main utility shed behind the lodge, Julian was standing in the snow. He was holding a useless decorative flashlight, freezing in his expensive leather boots, and a designer wool coat that was entirely inadequate for a real storm. I walked past him without a word. I popped the heavy metal side panels on the generators and showed him how to bypass the gelled primary filters. I showed him how to manually bleed the fuel lines, using a hand pump and a rag soaked in methyl hydrate. My hands were freezing, the joints cramping in the brutal cold, but I didn't stop. I made him hold the flashlight. I made him stand there in the wind and watch my hands do the work. "Prime it," I told him, stepping back and pointing to the manual lever. He stepped forward and hit the primer hard. The massive diesel engine coughed, sputtered violently, and then roared to life, blowing a cloud of black exhaust into the snow. The lights in the main lodge flickered, surged, and held solid. The low, heavy hum of the commercial heating units kicked back on. We stood there in the snow for a minute, smelling the diesel exhaust. "Thank you," Julian said, his teeth chattering audibly. "Don't buy Summerblend diesel in November," I replied, wiping thick black grease off my hands onto an old shop rag. "Go inside before you get frostbite." That night shifted something. Not a lot, just a fraction of an inch, like a single click on a compass dial. He realized that the safety net he thought he had outgrown was the only thing keeping him from freezing in the dark. He stopped trying to be a visionary and started trying to be an operator. Some days I wonder if I did the right thing. I look at the blue binder in my desk drawer, the legal paperwork that effectively stripped my only son of his absolute independence, and I wonder what Sarah would think. She would probably hate the ruthlessness of it. She wanted him to soar, but she didn't understand that if you let a kid soar without teaching him how to build a landing gear, the crash is inevitable and fatal. Most days I know I did the right thing. That's enough. I don't regret what I did. I regret that I had to do it. I regret that it took the near total destruction of his ego, a brutal winter storm, and the very real threat of financial ruin to make him sit at a table and simply listen. We speak once a week, now, mostly about the resort, sometimes about the weather patterns coming in over the mountains. It is a slow, methodical rebuilding of a bridge that was entirely burned to the waterline. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow. I am willing to take the time. I walked into my study this afternoon. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a heavy, suffocating silence anymore. It was just the peaceful quiet of an empty room. I sat down at my oak desk. I looked at the topographical maps, the scattered graphite pencils, and the 1978 solid brass surveyor's compass sitting on the corner. I reached out. I didn't turn the bezel this time. I just rested my hand on the cool glass. True north is still out there. We're just taking a very long detour to find it. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.